Hello, everyone, and welcome to City Lights Live. I'm your host, Peter Maharawal, and tonight, City Lights, in conjunction with the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project and Duke University Press, celebrate the publication of the new book, Silicon Valley Imperialism, Techno Fantasies and Frictions in Post-Colonialist Times. It's by Erin McElroy and published by Duke University Press. Before we begin, as is customary, I would like to acknowledge we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ohlone peoples. I would like to take this moment to offer our respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Anyone who's lived in the Bay Area for any length of time is all too aware of the effects of gentrification on the quality of life here. I mean, having lived here all my life, I can personally attest to the socioeconomic catastrophes that have followed the various tech booms we've experienced. In Silicon Valley Imperialism, Erin McElroy maps the process of gentrification, racial dispossession, and economic predation that drove the development of Silicon Valley in the San Francisco Bay Area, and how that logic has become manifest in other parts of the world. Like an infectious condition, gentrification has crossed borders and emerged in such places as post-socialist Romania. Erin McElroy draws on extensive ethnographic fieldwork and archival research in Romania and the United States, exposing the mechanisms through which Silicon Valley-style technocapitalism replicates itself, devouring space and societies, displacing residents, generating extreme economic inequality, and dulling cultural expression in order to expand its reach. Professor McElroy accounts for the ways Romanians are resisting Silicon Valley capitalist logics, where anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist activists and protesters work towards establishing more just social formations. So addressing the violence of Silicon Valley imperialism, Ms. McElroy reveals technocapitalism as an ultimately unsustainable model of rapacious economic and geographic growth. Erin McElroy is assistant professor of geography at the University of Washington and co-editor of Counterpoints, a San Francisco Bay Area atlas of displacement and resistance. She co-founded the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project in 2013 and has since led the group in its growth and creative direction. With a background in community organizing, visual arts, and feminist science studies, Erin's work critically engages geography and the humanities with a decolonial methodology. Joining her tonight in an evening of conversation, she's brought together an all-star cast of activists and scholars to plumb the depths of Silicon Valley imperialism. We have with us Chris Carlsson, who is an activist, historian, writer, editor, designer, bicyclist, tour guide, and true Renaissance fellow. He's authored numerous books. He's been in the orbit of City Lights for many years, and we've also published books with him, the most recent of which is a novel not published by City Lights. It's called When Shells Crumble. We just hosted an event for that. You can see that on our YouTube page. Also joining us tonight is Manissa M. Maharawal. Manissa has been published in the Annals of American Association of Geographers, in Antipode, and Sociological Quarterly, the American Anthropologist, The Guardian, N+1, and many, many other academic and cultural journals. She's the author of the forthcoming book, The Activist City, Social Movement Structures of Feeling and the Politics of Place. She is actively involved with the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project and recently co-edited with Erin McElroy the project's first atlas, Counterpoints, the book I mentioned before. Also joining us is Toshio Meronek, whose writing has appeared in Al Jazeera, The Nation, Them, Truth Out, amongst other outlets. They host the podcast Sad Francisco, and their book, Ms. Major Speaks Out, is now available from Verso Books. And last but not least, we have also joining us Lisa Rofel, an anthropologist specializing in feminist anthropology and gender studies. She's professor emeritus in the anthropology department at the University of California in Santa Cruz. Her publications include Desiring China, Experiments in Neoliberalism, Sexuality, and Public Culture, and the book Other Modernities, Gendered Yearnings in China After Socialism. Please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Erin McElroy and friends. I will turn it over to Erin to get the evening started. Welcome.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Peter, for inviting me. Thank you to City Lights. And yeah, I'm just really excited to be here. Some of all of the panelists are people that I've respected for very long. Their work has been really inspirational in my own. And I'm also a big fan of City Lights. And of course, thanks to the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project for co-hosting this event, and to Duke University Press. And for people who don't know, the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project is a data visualization and digital storytelling collective that I co-founded back in San Francisco in 2013. And Manissa was and is still part of that project. And it continues to produce work about resisting gentrification in the San Francisco Bay Area, also New York and LA. But yeah, today we're here to talk about this new book that I wrote. Feels very funny to say that, Silicon Valley Imperialism. And I just wanted to say that it wouldn't be what it is without having been in community with so many people in San Francisco for so long. Most of the book actually takes place in Romania, which I know people are wondering why Romania, and I'll get to that. But it's really exciting to be able to present the book here in City Lights, because a lot of my thinking in the book really emerges out of organizing that I was a part of and that I continue to be inspired by in San Francisco. And I'm actually in the Bay right now. I wish we could all be together in person, but I'm also excited that people can join from other places. I was just in Romania a couple of days ago doing a sort of informal book tour there. And there I had to explain a lot about why San Francisco. Now I feel like I have to explain a lot more about why Romania, but we'll get there. Yeah, and I guess just one other thing that I'd like to say is that most of this book was written and conceptualized in the 2010s, during a time in which I was moving back and forth between San Francisco and Romania pretty constantly. And I still go back to Romania, and I still go back to San Francisco, but I'm not currently living in either. So I have tried to update the book as best as I could before it came out, to make it more relevant. But in a lot of ways, I see it a snapshot of different contentions and visions and happenings in the 2010s that hopefully offer different insights for kind of present organizing and present theorizing. I think when a lot of people write books, and especially ethnographic books, they imagine it's going to like come out that year and be immediately relevant, but it always ends up becoming a snapshot of some sort. So I'm just starting to realize that now. And I know that some of you have written books and know that feeling very well. But I would say, though, that most of it was written before the COVID-19 pandemic, and before some of the kind of violent atrocities that we're witness to happening in the world right now, which do really alter the political landscape that I write about. And I still think that the analytic of Silicon Valley imperialism could be useful to think about in understanding what's happening today, but I didn't get to talk about that or write about that in the book. But we can talk about that in conversation. So let's see. So I figured that I was told to keep this informal, not to do a kind of a fancy book talk, maybe to read a little bit from the book. But I think I would start off by just kind of explaining what the book is about, why I decided to write it, how it came to be, why Romania. And after I explain a little bit about that, I can read maybe a page or two from the book if that sounds good. So let's see, so where to start? So as I said, back in the early 2010s, I was involved in a lot of housing organizing in San Francisco. For a little while, I was, well, actually for about 3 or 4 years, I was part of a group called Eviction Free San Francisco, which was a mutual aid group Manissa was also a part of, that organized direct actions against gentrification and evictions in the city. And this was a time in which the city was being rapidly transformed by the tech economy. Obviously, it had happened before during the dot-com boom. But this was kind of a new moment of a lot of tech investment and real estate capital chasing tech capital and leading to a mass eviction crisis and gentrification crisis. This was the moment of the sharing economy, the Twitter tax break zone forming in downtown SF, and mass evictions. And so I was really interested in the sort of correlation between techno capital and real estate capital and evictions and gentrification, and also how people organized to resist dispossession. But during this time, I think not a lot of people in San Francisco who I was organizing with were probably aware of this, but I was actually going back and forth to Romania as well. And there are certain social centers there that I've been a part of off and on for a long time. The sort of activist movement that I have been privy to be a part of there often places its own genesis following 2008, which of course was the time of the foreclosure crisis and recession. But 2008 was also when NATO held a convention in Bucharest. It was the first time Romania had just joined the EU in 2007. For those who don't know, state socialism ended in Romania in 1989. And the 90s were this kind of period of intense austerity and disaster capitalism, in which a lot of assets that had been made public, including housing, during state socialism were being reprivatized and basically given back to the descendants of pre-socialist owners, which sounds very complicated, but in the 1950s, as the state socialist project was getting started, a lot of property was made public. So if there was a landlord that owned 13 properties, they would have to give 12 of them to the state, and then the state offered housing to people who didn't have housing. And so for a lot of people, including Roma communities who had been targeted by systems involving slavery and eugenic technoscience and just state racism for centuries, were given housing for the first time by the state during state socialism. And then you have, this sort of anti-communist movement fomenting, leading to the end of state socialism. And I'm not saying this to glorify state socialism, because there were many problems with it too, but there were also benefits when it came to housing. And these were eviscerated post-1989 through a series of property restitution laws. And a lot of the activist scene, the left scene in Romania, saw the disasters wrought by global capital. And so in 2008, with this NATO convention, a bunch of activists got together and formed a movement that's moved and shifted a lot since then. But there was a social center in Bucharest called the Biblioteca Alternativa, or the Alternative Library, that formed shortly after, and I got to live with them for a little while and learn about organizing in Bucharest. And then as I returned to Romania throughout the years, I got to be a part of a few different movements there, two different housing movements, one in Bucharest and one in Cluj. In Bucharest, the group is called the Common Front for Housing Rights. And in Cluj, it's called Social Housing Now. I've also been privy to spend a lot of time in other social centers during my time there, as they would come and go, but often spaces that were anarchist in nature, queer, anti-racist, and anti-US imperialism. But it happened to be that in 2010, in Cluj, this huge eviction took place, taking advantage of these property restitution laws, and over 300 Roma residents were evicted in the middle of the night. Some people died. Most people ended up getting pushed out 18 kilometers outside of the city center to this local garbage site called Patarut. And this eviction really kind of fomented the anti-eviction movement in Romania. But what was happening at that time in Cluj, also in 2010, was the city had actually gotten branded as the Silicon Valley of Eastern Europe. And to me, this was very strange, having been organizing, against evictions in San Francisco, which also is not Silicon Valley, but became Siliconized, if we want to call it that, in the 90s, and then again in this 2010 period. I began to wonder what makes an area Silicon Valley. What happens when an area becomes, known as Silicon? What does that even mean? And after having lived in Cluj, it's very clear to everybody living there, Cluj is not Silicon Valley. There might be aspirations of becoming Silicon Valley that not everybody shares, but people don't refer to it as such. And in Cluj, it really started, again, during this period when Nokia, which is actually a Finnish, tech company, but has a big presence in Silicon Valley, decided to relocate. It had a German factory where it was outsourcing hardware production, and it moved that factory to Cluj. And this was supposed to kind of spark the sort of dawn of the Silicon era in Cluj. And, all these jobs were promised, which was very exciting to people who had lost jobs in the recession. And it actually, they outside the factory was placed outside of the city, and it was downtown in the center of Cluj, which is, again, it's the capital of Transylvania. It's not the biggest city in Romania, but it's one of the most expensive today. There was supposed to be an office building that kind of for white collar workers built downtown, and this was actually supposed to take place right where the homes of the displaced Roma people had lived. So there was this kind of weird confluence of tech development, really sparked by Nokia, and then eviction sparked by this property restitution process, both of which were very anti-communist in nature. A lot of the language of Siliconization in Cluj had to do with this idea that everything during communism, including all of the technological production during communism, was antiquated and dark and bad, and that to sort of Westernize and meet this fantasy of becoming Western, which is very long-standing in Romania, going back centuries, that Romania had to really adapt to the sort of technology of the future. And so, conversations about smart cities, things like that became manifest. But, at the same time, it struck me that, San Francisco is also not Silicon Valley. Most people living in San Francisco don't say they live in Silicon Valley, but even people living in Mountain View or Palo Alto, or, some of the cities where the biggest Silicon Valley tech companies are based, people living in those cities don't necessarily claim to be living in Silicon Valley. So I became interested in how, on a material level, becoming Silicon does infer, capital transformation, evictions, dispossession, exploitation, but that Silicon Valley at the same time remains a fantasy of sorts, one that certain people aspire to kind of achieve, but that others resist in different ways. And, the original title of my book was actually Unbecoming Silicon Valley, because I became really interested in what does it mean to, once that sort of language is designated, what does it mean to resist it, or what does it mean to refuse it? And so that meant that a lot of my work was spent with different activists organizing against evictions, but also with, in the case of Romania, with technologists who had and still have very different understandings of technological histories. So, I was curious, like, why were Romanian tech workers so exciting to global capital? And it turns out that during communism in Romania, during state socialism, Romania excelled in hardware production. It was producing more like third and fourth generation computers than most other countries in the region. And, a lot of this was happening above ground. This was state-led, but it was still quite subversive. The Romanian state cloned these French computer models to kind of create their own computers in this factory in Bucharest called the Felix factory. But underground, in apartment buildings and in university computer labs, all sorts of places, people began cloning computers because they couldn't afford computers, like they couldn't afford to buy computers. This is in the 80s. And yeah, all sorts of knowledge was produced as to how to embrace the sort of deviancy and create technology outside of kind of consumerist models in relationship to what was happening in terms of capitalist techno development, but also despite it. And a lot of that knowledge continued to be fostered even in the 90s. People started setting up their own independent internet networks, which were very common in Romania in the 90s, late 90s. People continued to build their own computers. And by the early 2000s, Romania had one of the highest piracy rates in the world. And this is in part because of this kind of, knowledge, technological knowledge that people were able to generate. That, of course, was heavily repressed by the West. And so a lot of what I look at in the book is how that worked, how Romania became kind of pathologized as this place of a liberal technology. And I guess just as an example, there was a video that was produced in 2014 by Norton, which is a cybersecurity firm that is based in Silicon Valley. You might have Norton virus technology installed on your computer. But this technology company actually produced a film in 2014 called The Most Dangerous Town on the Internet. And it's basically about this Romanian city called Râmnicu-Vâlcea, which became known as Hackerville because it was, rendered as seeping with these hackers that were going to take down US democracy. It featured, some sort of infamous hackers. One was called a Guccifer, who embraced the style of Gucci and the light of Lucifer, apparently, but who had hacked Hillary Clinton's emails. And anyway, in this film, you kind of see these stories of these dangerous hackers. And by the time you get to the end of the film, there's this option to press a button and purchase Norton's technology, which will save you from this kind of the most dangerous town on the internet. So so a lot of what I look at in the book is how anti-communism has become such a kind of central logic to Silicon Valley imperialism and Silicon Valley companies. A lot of that got stirred up in 2016 with Trump and Russian hackers, but I'm looking at kind of what was happening even before that in terms of the idea that this Cold War idea that Silicon Valley was going to help the US win the Cold War, and how some of those logics have continued in Cold War aftermaths. And what else? I've also looked a lot at how, so today, this actually just got even more exacerbated. There's a growing fascist party in Romania called AUR, which means gold. It's sort of, you could liken it to the MAGA movement of the US, but it espouses to kind of return Romania to this pre-socialist past, which was considered, the sort of golden era in Romanian history. So like in the 1930s, Bucharest was considered the little Paris of the East, and cities like Timișoara in the West were considered the little Vienna of the East. And so you have all these kind of cities adopting these names, aspiring again to become Western in various ways. And so I'm interested in what does it mean that this idea of returning to this pre-socialist past, which was quite fascist, is also sort of being dreamt up by liberal proponents of Silicon Valley future day-to-day. And so I'm really interested in how liberalism and if we want to call it illiberalism or perhaps fascism, both aspire towards this sort of anti-communist ideal or embrace this anti-communist ideal to achieve different futures, but the fact that they share it in different ways, I think is telling. And so I'm really interested in that throughout the book. And just one other story, I guess, from the book, and then maybe I can either read something or hand it over to our amazing panel. But in 2012 in San Francisco, there was this famous moment in which IBM had this AI-driven computer called Watson AI, that beat two other opponents in the game Jeopardy. And this was a big deal in 2012. Like, how could a supercomputer beat humans at Jeopardy? And this computer won because it wagered more money than the other two players when a question was asked about the author of Dracula, which is Bram Stoker. And it was kind of interesting to me because Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula and never actually went to Romania. He wrote this from afar, kind of embracing these Gothic Orientalist tropes of the time. But Watson AI is named after Thomas Watson. And it turns out that Thomas Watson is the founder, first CEO of IBM. And he spent a lot of time in Romania in the late 30s and early 40s and actually brought these calculators to Romania that were used to engineer the Holocaust, used to kind of abet the state in the 1941 census that mapped out where Jews and Roma queer people lived, and was used as a technology of extermination. And then as soon as the communists came into power, IBM left with impunity. They didn't have to do any, they just left. They profited off of the situation and left. And then in 1989, as soon as state socialism ends, they come rushing back, and they're actually part of the absorption of socialist-era computer companies, and kind of absorb the workers and the infrastructure, and start, building outsourcing firms upon the exoskeletons of socialist factories. And then you get to 2012, where their supercomputer just happens to know this thing about Romania. And so in a sort of allegorical way, I'm interested in how, again, this sort of how anti-communism functions, and how particular ideals that were made manifest before socialism get returned to in this sort of post-socialist moment, and how that involves weird, strange entanglements between Silicon Valley and Eastern Europe or Romania. But yeah, the book isn't all doom and gloom. A lot of the latter half of the book is actually based more on my readings of artists' theater plays and speculative arts projects, and kind of outer space imaginaries about what different futures might look like that resist Silicon Valley logics, that imagine other sort of techno futures, that imagine outer space outside of the sort of Elon Musk like future of colonizing, Mars and stars and everything. And there's a lot to be learned, I think, from different ways that the future was imagined during state socialism, that a lot of artists that I'm interested in return to today, but not to restitute the state socialist project, but to really think about anti-capitalist alterities and other kinds of futures that we could materialize. So, some of them are looking at what can we learn from the hacker movement? Like, how can we think about, building computers or building technology outside of, corporate infrastructure, or, how can we imagine, a different relationship to the cosmos, or to, there was this, huge fascination during state socialism with outer space. And so I became really interested in that. And I also look at this speculative art project by two artists, Vera Popovic and Mircea Nicolae, called History Does Not Repeat Itself. And they kind of create these different scenarios in the 1990s that imagine that, for instance, like hackers got together with Roma feminist organizations and were able to keep, Western tech and US imperialism from kind of transforming Romania as it did. And they wonder, like, again, what could we learn from these different future imaginaries from the past? So anyway, so that's a lot of what the book does. There is one chapter 2, that's specifically just on San Francisco. And in that chapter, I'm thinking about how post-socialist theory and post-socialist analytics are actually quite useful in thinking about Silicon Valley and San Francisco as public spaces get transformed, as discourses of sharing, for instance, the sharing economy, are made manifest through these sort of capitalist projects. And I know that probably most people here aren't, immersed in post-socialist theory. I know that Lisa might be the only one, but for a long time, post-socialism was kind of used just to theorize transformations in Eastern Europe and in East Asia, sometimes in other places, Cuba, all sorts of places that had state socialist programs. But I got really inspired by actually some work from Neda Atamasowski and Kalindi Vora, who are really trying to think about post-socialism more capaciously, and what it means to pluralize post-socialism, or what it means to think about using post-socialist analytics, perhaps to provincialize things like capitalism or anti-communism, sort of in ways that we might think about post-colonialism doing to empire. So anyway, in that project, I'm kind of playing around with post-socialism and thinking about what it might mean to detach it from the sort of spatio-temporal myopia of just Eastern Europe, and what it might mean to think about it in San Francisco, where suddenly the Cold War gets read maybe differently, or the co-optation of public space can be theorized differently. Okay, maybe that's a good time to turn it over to the panel. I could read from the book, but I don't want to bore everybody, and I've been talking for a little while, so I don't know. Manissa, I know that you have to leave earlier than everyone else. I don't know if you want to start.
Sure. Okay, thanks for that, Erin. So I guess I just want to start. I have like a few questions for you. I guess just want to start by saying thank you for the book. I'm just been reading through it over the past few months, and every time I pick it up, I find something new to learn from it. And so it's really a gift that way, where I find myself, we did a lot of organizing together in the 2010s in San Francisco, and so but even when you write about that stuff, I learned something new. And so I've just been really enjoying the way that you, in this book, how large your scope is, I guess, what I wanted to say. We go obviously from San Francisco to Romania, but we also go from like the colonial past to spells for the future. We go from witches to vampires. Like I love how large the scope is here. And so I guess a question, and so that's one thing I really love about this book. The other thing I really love about it is how, as someone who writes about San Francisco, I love how it decenters San Francisco and the US more generally, in Silicon Valley in the US, as the primary place from which we understand tech capitalism, right? And so I find that so useful, because I'm one of these people who, like, I write about San Francisco. I think of it as the center of tech capitalism, right? But it's like, if we stop thinking about the center of tech capitalism, what can we learn? And that's one of the main things I've been learning from your book. And so I really appreciate that also. And I guess just like, I think you can take this question and hear from the other panelists, but just really quickly, when you say you went back and forth between San Francisco and Romania in the 2010s, and what I just want to ask you is what you think you learned from the organizing happening in San Francisco, like what you learned from that moment that we were both part of Google bus blockades and anti-eviction protests, and this like critique of the tech industry that we were building with other activists and community organizers and tenants. What you learned from that organizing that like you brought to Romania, and then vice versa, like what you learned from the organizing and all the collectives you're a part of and the social centers you're a part of in Romania that you think traveled with you back to San Francisco. And that's just something that I'm just really curious about, because I was one of those people who didn't know you were going back and forth to Romania at the time. I think I knew it somewhere, but I didn't really realize it. And so that's one question I had. The other question is, like, among all this like grand scope that you sort of present, like I said, from like these two different places to like the past to the future to, witches and vampires, which I love those sections. I love the section on witchcraft. And you just talked somewhat about the Bram Stoker stuff, like where these connections as you trace them and this scope, like where you think, like what's the center that it's operating around, and that's also because I just like, I want to hear you say it. I have some ideas, but I kind of want to hear you say it. And I think because I want to hear you say it is because I think there's something about unbecoming here, which feels very central. And so I guess I want to hear you articulate that. But thank you. But the main thing I want to say is thank you for this work. I feel like it's this little insight into how your mind works, and I just like love being able to open it up and be like, here's how Erin thinks. Yeah, I'll pass it on to somebody else just because I know you have three other people. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. That was, yeah, very generous of you. And wait, should we just kind of pass it along, or should I try to answer your questions now? What do you all
I
think?
wasn't sure how we were doing it.
I think you get to decide, Erin, whatever you want to do.
Yeah. Maybe I'll try to address them now, because I think if I get questions from everybody, then it might be
Yeah, do it.
yeah.
Totally.
Okay. All right. Thanks everyone for being patient. And yeah, Chris is the expert here because he got to do one. He was in my seat not that long ago. So thank you for helping me figure this out. I can try to address some of what you said, and let's see. But where to begin? So yeah, so I was going back and forth. And at first I don't think I was going back and forth with any idea that one set of struggles might inform another. I actually think I know that I began to think about evictions and resistance in Romania in terms of housing and anti-eviction organizing before I became immersed in that work in the US, which is something that I don't think I talked a lot about, or I don't think I was even very cognizant of at the time. But in terms of the order of events of my organizing, that is true. But I was also, though, organizing against corporate monopolies and just, I mean, from the anti-alter globalization movement onwards, I've been very immersed in the left in the US. And so I think that a sort of inherent critique of US empire and global capital is something that I probably take with me wherever I go. But I was very wary of imposing a certain way of thinking about that in a sort of US context somewhere else. And I guess when it came to organizing, I also was wary of being that sort of US subject that was imposing anything. So, but I was really interested in what lessons we could learn, or how we could share knowledge, and how we could, in the spirit of international solidarity, think about resistance together. And so I think just that framework was always really important to me. But so as I mentioned, these restitution evictions are kind of the main type of eviction that I was a part of organizing against. And again, these are when property that maybe was privately owned in the 30s was made national or public in the late 40s, early 50s, gets reprivatized in the late 90s or the 2000s. And so there was this idea that we had, that if we could better understand what properties might be subject to restitution evictions before they take place, that could actually help us do preventative organizing. So if we could figure out where all of the restitution evictions happened, and then we could figure out where properties that had been nationalized but that weren't restituted yet were, we could do work with different tenants living in those buildings, so they might be more prepared should a restitution eviction take place. And it turned out that some of the knowledge that I had developed in the mapping project became really useful in kind of doing that sort of mapping and geospatial analysis. I don't write about that in the book so much, but yeah, for a couple of years we were working on this together, trying to figure out if we could sort of predict and then organize preemptively against different evictors. There was also, I think, in Romania, a lot of the anger in the housing movement is against the state and the government. The mayor is often the main source of frustration. Obviously, we share that in San Francisco. But there, I think, was less of a focus in Romania on local landlords. And I having been, organizing against local landlords in SF for years, was very much like, we need to figure out who these people are, and But I also kind of came to realize, because of certain demands, that was a little bit less useful than perhaps like organizing against the government for certain demands. But I think that just has to do with different histories of socialism, of different relationships to the state. Yeah, and what else? I also became very wary of and learned a lot actually from my friends in Romania about different approaches to thinking about colonialism and empire. And I know that in contexts like San Francisco, to talk about colonialism means to talk about the dispossession of Ohlone land and also Ohlone resistance. To that, going back to Spanish settlers and then gold rushers and the U.S. empire and all of the kind of violence that followed, including a lot of technologists at the time who were these kind of California engineers that helped engineer colonization. But and so I think the housing movement, and I know you, Manissa, like you write about this, like to think about housing justice in a context like San Francisco, we have to think about colonization and decolonization as well, and kind of these, the kind of histories that predate, but also that live on and that very much inform the present in terms of Ohlone land back and land rematriation projects. But in Romania, to talk about, we could talk about, undoing the harms of restitution, but claims of indigeneity in Romania are actually quite fascist. People who claim to be indigenous are the people who are part of this Our Party, who want to make some sort of claim that the true Romanians are, either predate or are part of the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago, and that everybody who's come since then, including Roma people, including Jewish people, are the colonizers. And so I became aware of just like very different ways that understandings of land and colonialism work. And I think to talk about US empire in Romania is connected to the way we talk about US empire in the US, but also different. And so I became really interested in kind of having those conversations with people and thinking about, the multiple aspects of US empire that we need to understand to kind of have maybe a better picture of the different ways that it operates, but also how it all connects. And I guess that's what I'm trying to do. I don't know. That didn't fully answer your questions, but maybe those are just.
No, that was useful. I appreciate that. Thanks, Erin.
Yeah. Maybe I could just hand it over to Lisa, because Lisa, you're right next to Manissa in my screen. Does
Oh, okay.
that work? Or?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So, I just love this book. I think it's brilliant. I had the pleasure and honor of working with Erin when they were getting the PhD at UC Santa Cruz, but I take no credit at all for Erin's brilliance. So I just feel like I benefited a lot from talking to you. My work in China, I've worked in China over the last 40 years and written books about the intersection of gender, sexuality, and political economy. And mostly I've focused on the huge transition in China from the socialist era to the post-socialist era. So, and to China embracing transnational capitalism. And I co-wrote a book called Fabricating Transnational Capitalism between China and Italy with Silvia Nagisako. And then most recently, I've been looking at China's rising presence in the global South and have been doing research in Brazil, Ecuador, Argentina, also Angola, Egypt. Anyway, so China's a whole different kettle of fish than Romania, given that it's quite powerful in the world today. But the post-socialist questions are really, really important. And and the state has a different role to play, I think, than in Romania. So that also makes a huge difference. What I really treasure about this book is your incredible supple way of literally juggling multiple things together in this broad landscape, and namely post-socialism, empire, imperialism, liberalism, illiberalism, and then really holding on to the activism as the roots by which you offer insight into the what you call the unbecoming of Silicon Valley imperialism, because and what I really want to emphasize here is that you show an intimate connection between what's happening in Romania and what's happening in California and maybe US more broadly. I just, by way of anecdote, some years ago now, certainly before the latest genocide in Palestine, some years ago now, a colleague and friend of mine, also activist, was kind of questioning my activism around Palestine liberation. And that person said, I prefer to work on things at home, basically, is what they said. And I got really pissed off, but I didn't have a good answer. It's like about, okay, well, how are we connected to these other places? And the US being the center of an empire, I actually started reading about the Roman Empire. I was kind of curious, did people in the Roman Empire at the center just know nothing about what the Roman Empire was doing outside of, that area around Rome? So because that is true of the US, people generally are not given the political knowledge to understand why we must pay attention to what the US is doing elsewhere, because it affects our own lives. It, first of all, sets up the privileges that we don't question about our access to certain resources on the one hand, and it's like the experiments the US empire does in other places, are also used at home. So both of our privileges and our, let's say, racial banishments that you use from Ananya Roy, all of those, the dispossession, they're all interlinked. And so your book offers a beautiful answer about why we have to pay attention to both. How you show exactly how they're intimately connected, and then how the activism to, as you keep saying, unbecome Silicon Valley, how that activism is connected, and we must build that kind of movement in order to try to create a world we would want to live in, as opposed to a world we're just barely surviving in. So I really appreciate that. And I didn't have a huge question. Maybe you could say a little bit more about you talk in several places about people holding on to different versions of the socialist era. And maybe you could say a little bit about how they come to hold on to that. Because, when I think about China, I find very, very a few leftist intellectuals holding on to some pieces of socialism, but lots of people not doing that. And I won't take up time explaining why here, but I just was curious, what enables people to even hold on to those pieces?
Yeah, no, thank you. And I am very indebted to you for this book. And yeah, so when I was working on my dissertation, Lisa was on my committee, and we were both actually living in the same neighborhood and sometimes commuting to Santa Cruz from San Francisco. And I feel like so many of those conversations really actually helped me think a lot. But also your work on fabricating transnational capitalism and the way that you approach post-socialism in that book, to me, has been very influential as well. And I can see that project being a sort of sibling of sorts with what I'm trying to do in terms of thinking of two locations together and the kind of connections between them in this post-socialist framework. So yeah, just to say that. And I think that is interesting that you don't, I mean, I think that we should talk more about why, I'm curious to hear more of your thoughts as to why people don't hold on to the socialist project in China as much. And I know that it's a really different context. But yeah, there is, you know, some people call it socialist nostalgia in Romania, and many people don't have that and are instead, you know, very invested in Romania becoming Western. And that's, like I said, I think too, like a really old project in Romania. The French Enlightenment was very significant in terms of Romania modernizing, and yeah, there I think aspirations to become Western often were tied to France until the 20th and 21st centuries. And now I see the US as really having abdicated France's place, although France is still very important in Romania. But nevertheless, in the 80s, you know, so many people were living their lives assuming that the state socialist project was going to continue. And, you know, not every, I mean, there was extreme austerity in part because Romania actually was severely indebted to the IMF and was trying to pay off these loans. And the head of the Communist Party, Ceausescu, was not a great guy and was definitely, you know, people call him a dictator. And so this isn't to kind of glorify him or glorify the sort of authoritarian nature of what happened, but people living their lives, you know, you'll see in kind of anti-communist rhetoric, like, oh, there were bread lines, people were waiting forever for food, people didn't have heat, but also most people had jobs. There wasn't homelessness. People had education. Actually, in tech, this is interesting. There was, it wasn't completely even, but there was much more gender equity in tech than you see in Silicon Valley today. So that's kind of interesting. But yeah, things were not amazing, I suppose, but things weren't horrible for a lot of people, especially when it comes to kind of basic needs. And all of that was eviscerated in the 90s. And, you know, so people, like a lot of my friends who maybe are in their late 30s or early 40s now, their parents were perhaps in their kind of, you know, early 20s when the socialist project ended. And so a lot of my friends talk about their parents having gotten degrees in engineering or this or that, and just thought that they were going to have these jobs, you know, forever and have job security, have a home, live a life. Suddenly everybody lost their jobs. And, you know, so people who had engineering degrees were suddenly, like, I don't know, piecing things together, you know, driving taxis, doing this. People got really into gambling. There were more of these kind of gambling houses in Romania than anywhere else in the Eastern Bloc. But everybody was just basically trying to find a way to win at this game of capitalism that was, you know, rigged against them. And so people got really depressed. Like a lot of my friends' parents have extreme depression because the sort of dreams that they grew up with were shattered. And then for people who've lost their homes due to these evictions, same thing. And so I think all of this leads to a context in which people do begin to not necessarily glorify the state socialist project, but realize that something else beyond, you know, the capitalist project would be better, and that there are things that took place during state socialism that were not so bad, that would be great to sort of regain. And so the housing group that I've been most involved with in Cluj, called Sociala Acum, or social housing now. Social housing is what they're fighting for, and they make the point that during state socialism, you know, 30% of the housing was social. And it's funny now in US housing movements, everybody's gotten into social housing, but they make the point that they had social housing and now there's no social housing, you know. And so I think there are things like that people are fighting for and organizing around. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. Maybe I'll hand it over to Toshio, who's next in line. And for those who don't know too, Toshio I've been very lucky to be on Toshio's podcast, San Francisco, twice, where we've had like really great conversations about all of this stuff. So I feel like just very, very grateful for that and excited to have you on.
No, I've been so lucky to have Erin as a repeat guest. And one of my favorite guests because you have such a deep knowledge of the things that are included in this book from like both the academic and activist viewpoints. And I feel like it's like the perfect melding of that. And I owe you and Anti-Eviction Mapping Project so much for basically writing the podcast, writing some of the articles that I've done in the past. Erin and I met at a Google bus protest like 15 years back, probably. And when Google buses were like a symbol of the gentrification and displacement that was happening in the city for a few years. And something that I was really excited to see a lot of in this book is just like a deep understanding around like the symbols and the sort of like the narratives that need to be told to get people to move to a place like Cluj, gentrify the place, to get corporations to come in. It actually requires like a deep knowledge of like public relations, I think, and marketing, certainly propaganda and astroturfing. Like all of these different things are covered in this book that aligns pretty much perfectly with my interests. So very honored to be here with a bunch of people that I really respect and are much smarter than me. One of the like things that interest me about your work more generally, but also specifically about this book is the way that you're able to tell stories via place, via in the case of this book, like Cluj, San Francisco, the outskirts of Cluj, where a lot of Roma were forced to move thanks to some of the gentrification. If I had a question, I guess I would ask if not Cluj, because we've talked about like how this idea of silicon ... gets reproduced in so many places as these sort of like hype cycles come to different areas around the world. You know, in Phoenix, I remember when people were calling it Silicon Desert. Certainly some people will be familiar with all of these are very corny names usually, but like Silicon Alley in New York, just wondering if not for Cluj, what where would you have set the book?
That's a really hard question. But a good question. Yeah, I don't know, like that I would have written a book, but I think that branding of Cluj as Silicon Valley really was one of the things that animated me to start going through the processes that became writing this book. But I do think it's quite interesting that there are so many of these silicon places, like you mentioned. There's like Silicon Docks in Dublin. I think Silicon Wadi is in like Tel Aviv, Silicon Prairies in Texas. You know, it's just like, I don't know. It's like, it becomes such this aspirational project, maybe like a smart city project too. It's like everybody's building smart cities, but we don't really know what they are other than like there's free Wi-Fi or something in there, you know. Right. But it's, you know, I think, you know, writing this book from another one of these Silicon places would have ended up being an interesting project, but it would have been so different because for me, yeah, the socialist period, its relationship to technology, anti-Roma racism, certain things that are not unique to Romania, but I think very much, yeah, like integral in understanding these different tensions. And a city like Cluj would be different, but I'm sure there would be a lot of connections if we were looking at some of these other places. So yeah, I've thought about that though. What it would, it's what would it mean to kind of study some of these other Silicon places together? Or for a little while, I was thinking it would be cool to do some sort of anthology and invite people who work on these other cities to contribute and to kind of think about this process of Siliconization, but also resisting it together, because I can't speak to what's happening in so many of these other locations, but I also wonder, like, will there be a time when this kind of stops and it's considered like, oh, this antiquated thing they were doing in the, like 2010s, 2020s, like naming everything as Silicon, because yeah, Silicon Alley doesn't really exist so much anymore in New York, or it kind of got absorbed into the whole city. But for now, I think that word Silicon still has so much traffic, and it's such a random, funny word. It's like, this element, this product, silicon chips. It's like we don't ever actually talk about what that means materially when we talk about these places, because now it's all software development and AI and blah. But I don't know if that really answers your question, but I have a sense that this Silicon's not going anywhere yet. Maybe at some point it will. But,
yeah, no,
yeah.
thank you. Yeah, no, I could listen to you talk about this stuff all day, because it's, and going from San Francisco to Austin to now Seattle, which seems like Austin and Seattle had similar transformations to San Francisco back in the day. I'm interested to hear more of your thoughts on that in the future. But
yeah, no, totally. And that has actually been interesting. I feel like I'm chasing Silicon Valley. Like I can't go anywhere without I only end up working in these Silicon Valley places. But yeah, but I do think it's interesting that, right now, or really for the last few years, so many of these Silicon Valley companies are actually moving to, well, you see Musk actually, moving Twitter HQ to Austin, or SpaceX to somewhere else in Texas. And there is this ongoing kind of shift from California. One of the things I look at in the book is the sort of rise of digital nomads as these sort of avatars for Silicon Valley imperialism. And that actually has picked up a lot in the last couple of years, in the pandemic, with this turn to remote work, with all these, tech layoffs. And yeah, like Romania actually has it's a national digital nomad visa right now, where if you're a tech worker in Silicon Valley and you can prove that you make 3 times the national salary in Romania, and that you have healthcare from like not the national health insurance plan of Romania, you can bypass like residency requirements in Romania and get digital nomad residency. So anyway, I'm just saying this to say, yeah, there's whatever comes out of Silicon Valley is continuing to move in different ways as time goes, including sort of Silicon Valley people and companies. But yeah. But yeah, maybe I'll turn it over to Chris, who's last but not least, but yeah, somebody I've been also very inspired by for a long time. And Chris actually wrote the forward to the Counterpoints book. So yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Erin, and thanks for everybody else and all your interesting commentaries. I was going to emphasize a couple of things and sort of leave you with a bunch of really difficult questions to try to make a stab at. I really appreciate the way that your book speaks to political imagination. I feel like that's one of the key elements that I was animated by when I was reading it. And it's not like you necessarily give us full answers to those provocations, but I think that you've identified correctly this, as you refer to it, as sort of going beyond, post-Soviet studies and post-colonial studies to the post-Cold War, sort of a unified framework for understanding the world that we're emerging into. But of course, we're living through this difficult week here in the United States, which I've done a pretty good job of ignoring, the horror of the political rhetoric coming out of these folks. But, this guy Vance, that's Peter Thiel's guy. You talk about Silicon Valley taking over, there you go. There's a piece of that story right there. But what I've been struck by, amongst other things, is that, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Bernie are perhaps the most intense people to embrace Biden in this moment, which I thought, why would they do that? And then I realized you actually talk about that in your book. And I found this quote here is, it's right in the beginning of the book. He said, I'm particularly interested in how post-Cold War liberal cosmologies chart new conduits between the Enlightenment and Silicon Valley. And I'm also concerned with how liberal negations of illiberalism, this sort of Democrats versus Republicans, if you will, messily collapse fascism, authoritarianism, communism, and un-Americanism, basically anything that stands in the way of Western becoming. I thought that was a really useful way of framing it, because I think that is this impasse. You say we're at an epistemological impasse with this endless opposition of two essentially empty positions, liberalism versus illiberalism, although the liberalism is more malleable and has actually got more of a hold on people's imaginations. So as you say, I'm just going to run through a few things that I highlighted in your book, so people can hear some of the good stuff that's in there. So you, at some point here, just in the early pages still, while socialism as a utopic and anticipatory project has been discredited as a dream from the past, in fact, it has never fully arrived. Thank you. Hardly anybody ever says that. There never has been socialism, really. This state capitalist nightmare that had taken place in various parts of the world, Maoist China wasn't really also just a version of Stalinism, in my opinion. No offense to anybody who feels differently, but I don't see where we've ever really tried anything remotely approaching true socialism, where the average human being really controls their fate, controls questions of technological development, controls how we organize the urban experience and the urban, the shape of housing, the shape of how we live together in cities, how we grow food, how we manage our water, etc. But a little later on, you talk about techno-liberalism quite a bit, and I think that's a complicated term that deserves unpacking. Maybe you want to take a stab at that. But I'm going to quote you here. He says, techno-liberalism also gets at how, amid the fourth industrial revolution and second machine age, not only have racialized and gender differentiations been accelerated, but also sharing economy grammars have appropriated socialist understandings of communalism in order to advance capitalist expropriation. That's a little bit of a academic phraseology there, but you say it again a few pages later pretty clearly. Liberal futurity and its technologies thus require the predation of anti-capitalist ideals, which, to put it in a nutshell, the idea that we can all get along and work it out together and share everything, which sounds so pleasant when they were starting Uber and Lyft and Airbnb as their marketing approach, which was quickly thrown by the wayside as fast as they could. But it did get an awful lot of people to buy in, particularly tech workers or people who want to be tech workers, whether they're in Cluj or they're in at Stanford. They think they're doing something good for the world. They're trying to do the right thing. And they think this rhetoric speaks to that desire that they have, and they don't look through it. They don't get past it, and they get stuck in it. But I do wonder, and this is the first question, but I'm not going to stop talking until I give you two more. That line, liberal futurity and its technologies thus require the predation of anti-capitalist ideals. Might this not boomerang further into a genuine anti-capitalist revolt at some point? Might it not actually just linger in people's imaginations of why they're doing what they do, to come back and say, wait a minute, hold on, you've been lying all this time. This is not what I was fighting for at all. This is not the work I thought I was going to be carrying out. I refuse. And then you see some of that already with what's going on. Honey, I can't talk right now. My granddaughter here. Yeah, you see this a little bit with the protest by IBM workers and whatnot around Gaza, the Gaza situation, and it's horrifying what's going on, and everybody should be stopping doing the work that produces that world. And some people actually have and quit those jobs. Here's another question for you. There's a straight up line here. There is just as much to learn about liberalism from revolutions that never came to be as there is from those that have been assimilated into the realm of global capital. Okay, I want to know more. I want to know what you really think about what that, where does that leave you? And then the last thing I wanted to bring up, which I guess I could go on and on, but we're running out of time and I don't want to, but I want to kind of prompt you to tell us what smeshery is and how that relates to your work with the anti-eviction mapping project, because it feels like that's a San Francisco version of smeshery to me from what you, how you described it.
Thank you for those questions. And yeah, thank you for reading some of those lines too. And I should have been taking better notes in the beginning, but I guess since I wrote them, I should know what I was talking about.
I can read them again if you want.
No. I'm gonna just, I don't want to forget anything, but I guess let's see, to start, I think that's, yeah, I think what's happening now in the US, Democrats, Republicans, like I think, and I too, I think when there was that sort of endorsement of Biden by Sanders and AOC, I was at first surprised, but then also like began to understand, you know, because we're trapped in this system. But the signifiers, yeah, but they stop signifying things after a little while.
I mean, if I could just say one thing about Bernie and AOC endorsing Biden so intensely, I think it's because as the left wing of the Democratic Party, they realize that the liberals hate them more than they fear fascism. Fascism, fine.
Yeah.
That's not the problem. The problem is people to the left of the liberals. So the liberals want to make sure they stay as marginalized as possible if they can't actually wipe them out entirely. And their embrace of Biden is because, well, he's given us this tiny crumb. And we got the person in the FTC, we got that person appointed there, and we've done these few policy things. We're going to hold on for dear life because anything from here is worse. So that, just add that in.
Yeah.
I meant to do that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I guess, I mean, maybe stepping out of that immediate context, I think part of what I'm looking at in the book, and I mean, this is what I think there's a point where I'm quoting Lilith Mahmood a little bit, where she's talking about the need to stop holding on to this sort of, you know, liberal future that's going to save us. Is I mean, what she's saying, and I agree, is that, you know, one of the ongoing problems is the disavowal from, you know, liberals of the left, of, you know, people actually fighting fascism, of the encampments, for instance, you know, on college campuses, you know, you have Pelosi claiming that people standing up against genocide are insiders from Russia. I mean, it's like this sort of thing, right? It's like, but that, yeah, my blame is often that, you know, liberals disavow us, fascists are out to destroy us, and you know, so it's sometimes more frustrating. We think that liberals might actually turn around, protect us, and then time and time again that doesn't happen. But so I think that's the sort of tension that I'm interested in. But it's really hard to understand a way out of it in the sort of current political schema. Obviously, the far right is terrifying, and like you said, like J.D. Vance is Peter Thiel's buddy. I mean, and some of the ideas coming out. I mean, so Thiel, you know, he was behind that Seasteading Institute some years back, and is now backing. I believe he's backing, actually, speaking of the appropriation of communist ideals, that this, what is it, Prospera, I believe it's this city in Honduras that is like this Bitcoin utopia, and
Oh, yeah.
but yeah, this guy Srinivasan too, who's backing Gary Tan in San Francisco, and the sort of city campus project, and San Francisco 2.0 in Solano. You know, it's basically all of these projects. They love to use the language of like, we're building these communes, we're coming together, and we're, you know, the city campus people are saying, and sorry, city campus is this project to kind of create this tech commune around like Alamo Square in San Francisco right now, and they're doing all this fundraising for it. But it's backed by this guy who believes in this like network state idea, which sounds, again, really like techno dystopic, but this idea that these kind of tech communes don't need the government. They're going to kind of supersede the government. They're going to live in these small communes run by tech CEOs. And I've been interested in that as following this sort of trajectory that I've been mapping out. It's sort of this new turn, because these guys are deeply in bed with the government. I mean, the US government wouldn't be what it is without this relationship with Silicon Valley and including with people like Peter Thiel when it comes to the far right. And then, the Democrats wouldn't be what they are without their relationships to Facebook, to Google, to, it's so either way, Silicon Valley is there, but then you have this sort of faction imagining a kind of post-state future, which I think would be quite impossible if they want to continue to kind of benefit from the things they want to benefit from. But it is this weird idea that they don't need the state anymore. And I think that's been the tension that we've seen amongst kind of techno-libertarians in San Francisco for some time. Like, taxis are too sluggish, therefore we need Uber or Lyft. Like, anything sanctioned by the government is too slow. We need something faster, better, that they're the ones that have the knowledge to kind of create this future. But they do love their kind of communal ideas of sharing. And I think that we don't really talk about the sharing economy anymore, but I think that we have open AI. We have this idea like we're going to open up AI and it's going to be a shared good, but yet it's run by, Microsoft, by these tech companies, profiting off of everything on the internet about us or that we've done. And so this kind of fantasy of openness, of, a sharing, whatever, kind of continues, I think, to be an operating, not a logic, but I think a piece of propaganda that many of the people making it actually do believe. When I was just in Romania, I was talking to somebody who actually thought that this effective altruism movement, which again is like this very strange, as you call it, a philosophy birthed in Stanford, that imagines that tech people are out to save the world, but that is actually not at all what they're doing. But people thought, oh, maybe that's a good thing, effective altruism. It sounds good, but it's, it's actually out there to make rich people richer and to, so.
The weirdest part of effective altruism is that the people behind it are now arguing that whatever they do in this world doesn't matter. They just need to get as rich as possible because they're going to spend it on the future digital persona who occupy in their trillions some fantasy world of their, bad science fiction of the future. So, and that goes, I don't know if you know Timothy Gebru from who got fired from Google as the ethicist, but she's done this great piece on First Monday about the TESCREAL bundle, which is transhumanism, et cetera, including effective altruism. So yeah, good for people to check that out.
Yeah, and the TESCREAL movement, I mean, that it's really creepy. And I mean, it's very eugenicist.
Very eugenicist.
And that's, so it's sort of, not like that it ever left Silicon Valley, but it's kind of come back.
You make that point of your book too. It's, techno-racial capitalism is what's really being wrought here across the planet.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think too, like these ideas of building these sort of utopias in outer space, like Elon Musk's vision, again, it's, done to kind of save humanity from itself. So he says, but then it's, just for the select few. And that's what you saw with the sort of Seasteading Institute, or these kind of islands that these tech people like to buy out. But I guess, okay, to get to Shmekaria, which you mentioned, maybe is something a little less creepy. Yeah, so that's a concept. It's a Romanian word with Romani roots. That means like a sort of like street smart, you're kind of cunning, badass, like something like that might be an equivalent in English. But it often infers, making something or doing something without capital backing you and kind of, doing something beyond the system. And it's a logic that I was excited to sort of find manifest in some of these hacker spaces that I was able to spend some time in. They were really interested in, for instance, creating hardware, like computers that wouldn't be dependent on corporate software. there was this understanding in the early 2000s, like once you install Microsoft operating systems on your computer, that you would never be able to, operate freely, actually freely. You would always be kind of beholden to Microsoft system upgrades, to the sort of data grabbing that it does, to the limitations it has. So, I mean, you see this in different free and open hardware movements all over the world, but, you know, this desire to kind of create systems that are independent and open, not in the kind of open AI way. And so a lot of people would describe, you know, being able to build one of these computers as kind of embracing some sort of shmekheria, or creating these independent internet networks that were really popular in the 2000s, that were just kind of done mostly by youth connecting different apartment buildings on their block. They would say that was done with shmekheria, or even just kind of downloading and pirating a bunch of like software or music or whatever it might be. And in terms of maybe parallels in the US, I think what I like about that is it's not techno-dystopic. I mean, it's really easy to become a Luddite in the kind of context of, and I do embrace Luddism in terms of a movement to fight against techno-capital. But I sometimes get excited about these little ways that people find to create different techno futures outside of capitalism, or that resist capitalist logics. And so, some of what we've done in the anti-eviction mapping project, I think, could aspire to you know, be in a similar you know, camp, so to speak. Like one of the projects we've been working on for the last 4 years is called a Victor book, and it's you know, I'm making fun of Facebook, obviously, but it's a piece of software that we developed where you could look up a landlord and figure out all of the different properties that they own, and if they've evicted anywhere in any of those properties, and all of their corporate connections. So sort of the Facebook, but for serial evictors. And in that, you know, that sense, we're sort of turning certain technology around and trying to use it for other features and other means. And so maybe that's embracing a form of shmekheria, like you said. So
Well, we have come to the end of the road here and run out of time. I want to thank you all for gracing our virtual halls tonight. And Erin, congratulations on this powerful new book. And also for all the really great work that you and everybody on the panel tonight has done over the years in trying to make the Bay Area and the world a more equitable and just place. Your activism, everyone, is just a really amazing, you know, example, the way that you kind of generate cultural resistance. We really appreciate it here at City Lights. So it means a great deal that we could bring all of you together in one place at one time, celebrating this really great book. So Erin, congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And thanks to Manissa, Lisa, Toshio, and Chris for being here. I feel really very lucky and blessed to be able to share this space virtually with you all. So thank you. And I'm looking forward to more conversations. So.